Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 11 of the Garot podcast. I am your host, Chingachgook, and I am once again in studio with my co-host, Mr. Howard Roark. I know in previous episodes we have done this public service announcement multiple times. If you are new, welcome. If you are a returning listener, welcome back. If you haven't listened to the previous episodes, please do go back and listen to them in sequence. It is very important, particularly at this point in the podcast, that you, the listener, have a working understanding of the definitions and the freestanding claims that we have laid out thus far, because there's a lot of synthesis that's beginning to happen. Case in point, I am very much strapped to the front of Persig's train. I acknowledge that my co-host is in a somewhat unenviable position, given the fact that it is my role to be able to guide us, the two of us sitting here, those of you sitting at home, through the meta of what it is that we're trying to unpack. I know where it is we need to go. I understand and I know the content that we need to get to. I know what it is that we need to pull into articulated knowledge. But it is not clear to me how to describe it. And so, what would be the first step then? In keeping with the theme of this entire podcast, we are trying to take terms that exist in our parlance, specifically in the conversations that Howard and I have, and render them into articulated knowledge. To use terms that we've already established in previous episodes. Another way of saying that would be, we are trying to take terms and render them into freestanding claims. The idea being that once they are in the format of a freestanding claim, they become portable. They become immediately deployable regardless of conversational context, at least as much as possible. So we have 3 items on our list today that we need to articulate. The 3 terms are the prisoner's dilemma, the fog, and initiation. Now, these terms, upon first examination, seem to invoke, in the generic listener, 2 main reactions, or at least they seem to exhibit 2 primary characteristics. Characteristic number 1 is that they seem to be somewhat innocuous, particularly terms like initiation. This is a word that exists in the dictionary. I was like, all right, well, why can't I just go to dictionary.com and look up the word initiation? Doesn't that just give me the meaning and the definition that I need? And also even prisoner's dilemma. Prisoner's dilemma is a thought experiment that has been a part of academic philosophy for a while now. So the fog might seem to be more metaphorical upon first examination, but out of the 3, that's probably the easiest to handle, because the fog is a term that comes from Dr. Peterson's book, Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life, which we will be examining shortly. The key point is the reason why the fog is the easiest of the 3 is because Dr. Peterson has already put in the work of articulating what it means. But there's another consideration at play here. These 3 terms can and do stand on their own, but they exist in a kind of relation to each other. I want you all who are sitting at home listening to this to envision the shape of an upside down letter V. So a letter V, except it's pointing upwards to the top. Or you can also envision it as a triangle with the point facing upwards and the bottom side of the triangle missing. If I were to describe a roadmap, an outline for what it is that we need to cover in this episode, I would say that this image, this shape of an inverted letter V, captures what it is that I am trying to articulate in this episode. This shape, this inverted V, represents the way that these 3 terms interact with each other. On the one hand, if you can imagine, on the left-hand side at the base of the inverted V would be the prisoner's dilemma. And on the exact opposite side, the right-hand side of the base, would be the term the fog. Now, both of these things seem to be describing independent ideas, but the implication that arises from both of these terms actually leads to the same point. And that's where the term initiation lies. Both of these terms are getting at the importance and the necessity for initiation. Well, now we come to a peculiar crossroads, a peculiar situation when it comes to the question of, well, what does initiation mean? How is it that we can explain what initiation is before we first understand clearly what the prisoner's dilemma is and what the fog is? Because if you were to just go to dictionary.com and look up the term initiation, it would be of zero help. The first step, I believe, in unpacking this inverted V would be to first take a look at the fog. What is the fog? And like I said, of the three, it's probably the easiest because it is a term that comes from Dr. Peterson's own writing, and he does a good job of articulating what it is that he's talking about. So, what I'm about to read now comes from Rule 3 from Dr. Jordan B. Peterson's Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life. And the title of this chapter is Do Not Hide Unwanted Things in the Fog. I'll just start reading from the top. Those damned plates. I love my father-in-law. I respect him too. He's extremely stable emotionally, one of those tough or fortunate people, perhaps a little of both, who can let the trials and tribulations of life roll off him and keep moving forward with little complaint and plenty of competence. He is an old guy now. Del Roberts, 88. He has had a knee replaced and is planning to get the remaining one done. He has had stents inserted into his coronary arteries and a heart valve replaced. He suffers from drop foot and sometimes slips and falls because of it. But he was still curling a year ago, pushing the heavy granite rock down the ice with a stick specifically designed for people who can no longer crouch down as easily as they once could. When his wife, Beth, now deceased, developed dementia at a relatively young age, he took care of her in as uncomplaining and unresentful a manner as anyone could imagine. It was impressive. I am by no means convinced that I could have fared as well. He cared for her right to the point where it became impossible for him to lift her out of whatever chair she had settled into. This was long after she had lost the ability to speak. But it was obvious by the way her eyes lit up when he entered the room that she still loved him, and the feeling was mutual. I would not describe him as someone who is prone to avoidance when the going gets tough. Quite the contrary. When Del was a much younger man, he was for several decades a real estate dealer in Fairview, Alberta, the small town where I grew up. We lived right across the street from the Roberts family, in fact. During that time, he habitually went home for lunch, in accordance with the general custom. Beth typically prepared him soup, probably Campbell's, which everyone ate at the time, and a sandwich. One day, without warning, he snapped at his wife. Why in the world do we always eat off these tiny plates? I hate eating off these tiny plates. She had been serving the sandwiches on bread and butter plates, which averaged about 6 or 7 inches in diameter, instead of full-size dinner plates of 10 to 12 inches. She related this story to her daughters, soon after, in a state of mild shock. This story has been retold to much laughter at family gatherings many times since. After all, she had been serving him lunch on those plates for at least 20 years by the time he finally said anything. She had no idea that he was annoyed by her table settings. He had never objected. And there is something inexhaustibly amusing about that. Now, It is possible that he was irritated by something else altogether that day and did not really care about the plates. And in one sense, it is a trivial issue. But seen another way, it is not trivial at all, for two reasons. First, if something happens every day, it is important. And lunch was happening every day. In consequence, if there was something about it that was chronically bothersome, even in a minor sort of way, it needed to be attended to. Second, it is very common to allow so-called minor irritations, which are not minor, as I said, if they happen constantly, to continue for years without comment or resolution. Here is the problem. Collect 100 or 1,000 of those, and your life is miserable and your marriage doomed. Do not pretend you are happy with something if you are not. And if a reasonable solution might, in principle, be negotiated, have the damn fight. Unpleasant as that might be in the moment, it is one less straw on the camel's back. And that is particularly true for those daily events that everyone is prone to regard as trivial, even the plates on which you eat your lunch. Life is what repeats, and it is worth getting what repeats right. Just not worth the fight. Here is a more serious story of the same type. I had a client who had come to see me about her plans to move to a private practice after many years as an accountant with a large corporation. She was well respected in her profession, and was a competent, kind, and careful person. But she was also very unhappy. I presumed initially that her unhappiness stemmed from anxiety about her career transition. But she managed that move without a hitch during the time we continued our sessions, while other issues rose to the forefront. Her problem was not her career change, it was her marriage. She described her husband as extraordinarily self-centered, and simultaneously overly concerned with how he appeared in the eyes of others. It was a contradictory combination in some manner, although it is common enough to see this touching of opposites in a personality. If you lean too far in one direction, something else in you leans equally far in the other. So, despite the husband's narcissism, at least from his wife's perspective, he was enthralled to the opinions of everyone he met, excepting the members of his own family. He also drank too much, a habit which exaggerated his temperamental defects. My client was not comfortable in her own home. She did not feel there was anything truly of her within the apartment she shared with her husband. The couple had no children. Her situation provided a good example of how what is outside can profoundly reflect what is inside. Which is why I suggest to people who are in psychological trouble that they might begin their recovery by cleaning up and then beautifying, if possible, their rooms. All their household furnishings, which she described as showy, ornate, and uncomfortable, had been chosen by her husband. Furthermore, he avidly collected 1960s and 70s pop art, and the walls of the house were crowded with these items, which he had spent time seeking out in galleries and otherwise gathering for many years, often while she sat waiting outside in the car. She told me that she did not care about the furnishings and the excess of decorative objects. But that was not really true. What was true was that she did not care for them, not a bit. Neither the showiness, nor the furnishings, nor the plethora of artworks that made up her husband's collection appealed to her taste. She tended toward a minimalist aesthetic, or perhaps that preference was a consequence of her husband's decorative excesses. It was never quite clear what she might have preferred, and perhaps that was part of the problem. Because she did not know what she liked, and was equally vague about her dislikes, she was not in the strongest position to put forward her own opinions. It is difficult to win an argument or even begin one if you have not carefully articulated what you want or do not, and need or do not. However, she certainly did not enjoy feeling like a stranger in her own home. For that reason, she never had friends over to visit, which was also a non-trivial problem, contributing as it did to her feelings of isolation. But the furnishings and paintings continued to accrue, one shopping expedition at a time, in Canada and abroad, and with each purchase there was less of her in the house and in the marriage, and increasingly more of her husband. Nonetheless, my client never went to war. She never had a fit of anger. She never put her fist through a particularly objectionable canvas hanging on the living room wall. In all the decades of her married life, she never had an outburst of genuine rage. She never directly and conclusively confronted the fact that she hated her home and her subordination to her husband's taste. Instead, she let him have his way, repeatedly, increment by increment, because she claimed that such trivialities were not worth fighting for. And with each defeat, the next disagreement became more necessary, although less likely, because she understood that a serious discussion, once initiated, risked expanding to include all the things that were troublesome about her marriage, and that a real, no-holds-barred battle would therefore likely ensue. Then everything wrong might spill out and have to be faced and dealt with by one means or another. So, she kept silent, but she was chronically repressed and constantly resentful, and felt that she had wasted much of the opportunity of her life. It is a mistake to consider the furnishings and the pop art paintings as simple material objects. They were more truly and importantly containers of information, so to speak, about the state of the marriage, and were certainly experienced as such by my client. Every single object of art was the concrete realization of a victory, Pyrrhic though it may have been, and the defeat, or at least a negotiation that did not occur and therefore a fight that was over before it started. And there were dozens or perhaps hundreds of these, each a weapon in an unspoken, destructive, and decades-long war. Unsurprisingly, given the circumstances, the couple split up after 30 years of marriage. I believe the husband retained all the furniture and art. Here is a thought, a terrifying and dispiriting thought, to motivate improvement in your marriage, to scare you into the appalling difficulties of true negotiation. Every little problem you have, every morning, afternoon, or evening with your spouse will be repeated for each of the 15,000 days that will make up a 40-year marriage. Every trivial but chronic disagreement about cooking, dishes, house cleaning, responsibility for finances, or frequency of intimate contact will be duplicated over and over unless you successfully address it. Perhaps you think, moment to moment at least, that it is best to avoid confrontation and drift along in apparent but false peace. Make no mistake about it, however. You age as you drift, just as rapidly as you age as you strive. But you have no direction when you drift, and the probability that you will obtain what you need and want by drifting aimlessly is very low. Things fall apart of their own accord, but the sins of men speed their deterioration. That is wisdom from the ages. It may well be that conscious apprehension of the horror of the same small hell forever repeated is precisely what is necessary to force you to confront the problems in your marriage and negotiate in good and desperate faith to solve them. However, it is the easiest of matters, particularly in the short term, to ignore the prick of conscience and let the small defeats slide, day after day. This is not a good strategy. Only careful aim and wakeful striving and commitment can eliminate the oft incremental calamity of willful blindness. stem the entropic tide and keep catastrophe, familial and social alike, at bay. Corruption, commission, and omission. Corruption of the form we are discussing is, in my opinion, integrally linked to deception, to lying more bluntly, and, more important, to self-deception. Now, strict logicians regard self-deception as an impossibility. They cannot understand how it is possible for a person to believe one thing and its opposite simultaneously. Logicians are not psychologists, however, and they obviously do not notice or else fail to take into account the fact that they themselves have family members, for example, for whom they at least occasionally feel love and hate at the same time. Furthermore, it is not obvious what believe, quote unquote, means when discussing human belief, or what is meant by simultaneously, quote unquote. I can believe one thing today and another tomorrow, and very often get away with it, at least in the short term. And on many occasions, I have experienced what was very nearly simultaneous belief in one thing and its opposite while reading undergraduate university papers, in which the writer made a claim in one paragraph and a completely contradictory claim in the next. Sometimes that happened within the span of a single sentence. There are many conditions or circumstances under which self-deception can theoretically occur. Psychoanalysts have explored many of these, with Freud leading the way. Freud believed that much of mental illness was due to repression, which is arguably and reasonably considered a form of self-deception. For him, memories of traumatically troubling events were unconsciously banished to the perdition of the unconscious, where they rattled around and caused trouble, like poltergeists in a dungeon. Freud understood that the human personality was not unitary. Instead, it consists of a loose, fragmented cacophony of spirits who do not always agree or even communicate. The truth of this claim is self-evident, at least in one simple manner. We can think about things, we can stimulate potential or alternative actions or events without immediately having to act them out. Dissociation of thought and action is necessary for abstract thought to even exist. Thus, we can clearly think or say one thing and do another. This is fine when merely thinking prior to acting, but perhaps not so good when we promise or claim to believe something and then act in a manner indicating that we truly have faith in something else. This is a form of deception, a disjunction in character, a contradiction between modes of being. It has even been named to claim one belief and then to act or speak in a different or even opposite manner constitutes a performative contradiction, according to certain modern philosophers. An implicit lie, in my opinion. The holding of contradictory beliefs also becomes a problem when the holder attempts to act out both simultaneously and discovers, often to his or her great chagrin, the paradox that makes such an attempt impossible. Freud cataloged an extensive list of phenomena akin to repression, the active rejection of potentially conscious psychological material from awareness, which he termed defense mechanisms. These include denial, the truth is not so bad; rejection formation, I really, really, really love my mother; displacement, the boss yells at me, I yell at my wife yells at the baby, and the baby bites the cat. Identification, I am bullied, so I am motivated to be a bully. Rationalization, a self-serving explanation for a low-quality action. Intellectualization, a favorite of early, funny, neurotic Woody Allen. Sublimation, I can always paint nude women. And projection, I'm not touchy, you're just annoying. Freud was an outstanding philosopher of deceit. He was not afraid to point out the relationship between dishonesty and psychopathology. Nevertheless, his ideas of self-deception suffer, in my opinion, from two major errors. First error. Freud failed to notice that sins of omission contributed to mental illness as much as, or more than, the sins of commission, listed above, that constitute repression. In doing so, he merely thought in the typical manner. People generally believe that actively doing something bad, that is, the sin of commission, is, on average, worse than passively not doing something good, that is, the sin of omission. Perhaps this is because there are always good things we are not doing. Some sins of omission are therefore inevitable. In any case, there are still times when willful blindness, nonetheless, produces more serious catastrophes, more easily rationalized away than the active or the unconscious repression of something terrible but understood, the latter being a sin of commission because it is known. The former problem, willful blindness, occurs when you could come to know something but cease exploring so that you fail to discover something that might cause you substantial discomfort. Spin doctors call this self-imposed ignorance plausible deniability, which is a phrase that indicates intellectualized rationalization of the most pathological order. It should be noted that such blindness is often regarded as an outright crime. If you are a CEO, for example, and you suspect that your treasurer is cooking the books, and you do not investigate because you do not want to know, you may still be liable for your inaction, as is appropriate. Failing to look under the bed when you strongly suspect a monster is lurking there is not an advisable strategy. Second error. Freud assumed that things experienced are things understood. In accordance with that assumption, he believed that a memory trace existed somewhere in the mind that accurately represented the past, like an objective video recording. These would be reasonable presumptions if our experience was simply a series of objectively real and self-evident events transmitted through our senses, thought about, evaluated, and then acted upon. If this was all true, traumatic experience would be accurately represented in memory, even when pushed out of awareness by unconscious mechanisms, because of its understood but terrible nature. However, neither reality nor our processing of reality is as objective or articulated as Freud presupposed. Imagine, for example, that you have been ignored, romantically, more than you can tolerate, for several months by your wife or husband. Then you encounter him or her leaning over the fence, talking in a friendly manner, and perhaps no more than that, to an attractive neighbor. How we process such anomalous, novel, troublesome, or even traumatic experience is very rarely a matter of perception, followed by conscious understanding and thought, then emotion or motivation derived from that thought, then action. What happens instead is akin to what we discussed at length in Rule 1 and Rule 2. We process the unknown world from the bottom up. We encounter containers of information, so to speak, whose full import is by no means self-evident. Upon witnessing your spouse talking to the neighbor, therefore, it is not as if you think in an altogether articulated and fully developed philosophical form. I have been lonesome and deprived physically for months by my spouse. Although I have not said anything in detail, this has caused me constant frustration and pain. Now he or she is rubbing it in, as far as I'm concerned, by being so outgoing with a comparative stranger when I have experienced so little attention. It is much more likely that anger, grief, and loneliness have accumulated within you with each rejection, bit by bit, until you are filled to the brim, and now overflowing. That sudden appearance of negative emotion does not necessarily mean that you are even now fully conscious of its accumulation. You may well, as in the case of my father-in-law or my client, have experienced the frustration build up gradually enough so that you found yourself more irritable and unhappy. But that does not necessarily mean that you noticed the cause. And what is the cause? The range of possibilities is uncomfortably broad. Perhaps you're not being ignored at all. Instead, you have been having trouble at work, and that has produced a decrease in your overall confidence. In consequence, you have become sensitized to any signs of rejection, even imaginary, within your marriage. So, what you must determine is not so much why your wife or husband is no longer attentive to you, but what it is about your boss, colleagues, or career that is destabilizing you. That puts the true cause of your discomfort a long distance away from the symptoms, i.e., the feelings of rejection, that are making you irritable, sensitive, and hurt. There is nothing obvious about the relationship between cause and effect in such cases. Perhaps you really are being ignored, just as you suspect. Perhaps it is a sign of an impending affair and a manifestation of the trajectory that leads to divorce. Both of these, if true, are serious problems. It is no wonder you are upset. But you may remain stubbornly unwilling to consider that your career or marriage is in trouble. And that is no surprise. But it is not helpful. On top of all that is the general complexity of life, complicating the search for clarity, consider the question, what really happened? Say, in a failed marriage, divorce, a child custody battle. The answer to that query is so complex that settling the disagreements frequently requires court evaluation and multi-party assessment. Even then, one or even both of the protagonists is unlikely to believe that the truth has been served. This is partly because events in general, and interpersonal events specifically, do not exist as simple objective facts, independent of one another. Everything depends for its meaning, for the information it truly represents, on the context in which it is embedded, much of which is not available for perception or consideration when the event in question occurs. The meaning of what someone's wife says to him today is dependent on everything both have ever said to each other, everything they have ever done together, and the contents of their mutual imaginations, and that does not exhaust the complexity. Such meaning may even be importantly dependent on how, for example, the wife's mother treated her father, or her grandmother treated her grandfather, as well as the relationship between men and women in the broader culture. That is why domestic arguments so often spiral out of control, particularly when a pattern of continual and effective communication has never been established. One thing leads to a deeper thing, and that leads deeper yet, until an argument that started over what size plates are best used at lunchtime turns into a no-holds-barred war about whether the marriage in question would be better dissolved. And there is certainly fear of falling down a hole that size, again, particularly when much has remained unspoken, that motivates the proclivity to keep things to yourself when they could be better, but dangerously said. What is the fog? Imagine that you are afraid. You have reason to be. You are afraid of yourself. You are afraid of other people. You are afraid of the world. You are nostalgic for the innocence of the past, for the time before you learned the terrible things that shattered the trust characterizing your childhood. The knowledge you have gained of yourself, other people, and the world has embittered more than enlightened. You have been betrayed, hurt, and disappointed. You have become distrustful even of hope itself, as your hope has been repeatedly shattered, and that is the very definition of hopelessness. The last thing you want is to know more. Better to leave what is enshrouded in mystery. Better, as well, to avoid thinking too much, or at all, about what could be. When ignorance is bliss, after all, 'tis folly to be wise. Imagine, more precisely, that you are so afraid that you will not allow yourself to even know what you want. Knowing would simultaneously mean hoping, and your hopes have been dashed. You have your reasons for maintaining your ignorance. You are afraid, perhaps, that there is nothing worth wanting. You are afraid that if you specify what you want precisely, you will simultaneously discover, and all too clearly, what constitutes failure. You are afraid that failure is the most likely outcome. And, finally, you are afraid that if you define failure and then fail, you will know beyond a shadow of a doubt that it was you that failed, and that it was your fault. So, you do not allow yourself to know what you want. You manage this by refusing to think it through. You are happy, satisfied, and engaged sometimes, and unhappy, frustrated, and nihilistic other times. But you will not inquire deeply into why, because then you would know, and then you would encounter yet again shattered hope and confirmed disappointment. You are also afraid, but for different reasons, to allow others to know what you want. First, if they were to find out just what you wanted, then they might tell you, and then you would know, even if you were fighting against gathering that very knowledge. Second, if they knew, they could then deny you what you truly wanted, even needed, and hurt you much more efficiently than they might if your deepest desires, and therefore your vulnerabilities, remained secret. The fog that hides is the refusal to notice, to attend to emotions and motivational states as they arise, and the refusal to communicate them both to yourself and to the people who are close to you. A bad mood signifies something. A state of anxiety or sadness signifies something, and not likely something that will please you to discover. The most probable outcome of successfully articulating an emotion that has accrued without expression over time is tears, an admission of vulnerability and pain, which are also feelings that people do not like to allow, particularly when they are feeling distrustful and angry. Who wants to dig down into the depths of pain and grief and guilt until the tears emerge? And a voluntary refusal to take notice of our emotional states is not the only impediment to dealing with them. If your wife or husband or whoever else you are tangled up with unhappily at the moment says something that comes too close to the painful truth, for example, then a sharp and insulting remark will often shut them up, and is therefore very likely to be offered. This is partly a test. Does the person being insulted care enough about you and your suffering to dig past a few obstacles and unearth the bitter truth? It is also partly, and more obviously, defensive. If you can chase someone away from something you yourself do not want to discover, that makes your life easier at the present. Sadly, it is also very disappointing if that defense succeeds, and is typically accompanied by a sense of abandonment, loneliness, and self-betrayal. You must nonetheless still live among other people, and they with you. And you have desires, wants, and needs, however unstated and unclear, and you are still motivated to pursue them, not least because it is impossible to live without desire, want, and need. Your strategy under such conditions? Show your disappointment whenever someone close to you makes you unhappy. Allow yourself the luxury and pleasure of resentment when something does not go your way. Ensure that the person who has transgressed against you is frozen out by your disapproval. Force them to discover, with as much difficulty as possible, exactly what they have done to disappoint you. And finally, let them grope around blindly in the fog that you have generated around yourself until they stumble into and injure themselves on the sharp and hidden edges of your unrevealed preferences and dreams. And maybe these responses are tests too. Tests deeply associated with the lack of courage to trust. If you really loved me, you would brave the terrible landscape that I have arrayed around myself to discover the real me. And perhaps there is even something to such claims, implicit though they may be. A certain testing of commitment might have its utility. Everything does not have to be given away for free, but even a little unnecessary mystery goes a long way. And you still must live with yourself. In the short term, perhaps you are protected from the revelation of your insufficiency by your refusal to make yourself clear. Every ideal is a judge, after all. The judge who says, you are not manifesting your true potential. No ideals, no judge. But the price paid for that is purposelessness. This is a high price. No purpose? Then no positive emotion. As most of what drives us forward with hope intact is the experience of approaching something we deeply need and want. And worse, when we are without purpose, chronic, overwhelming anxiety, as focused purpose constrains what is otherwise likely to be the intolerable chaos of unexploited possibility and too much choice. If you make what you want clear and commit yourself to its pursuit, you may fail. But if you do not make what you want clear, then you will certainly fail. You cannot hit a target that you refuse to see. You cannot hit a target if you do not take aim. And, equally dangerously, in both cases, you will not accrue the advantage of aiming, but missing. You will not benefit from the learning that inevitably takes place when things do not go your way. Success at a given endeavor often means trying, falling short, recalibrating with a new knowledge generated painfully by the failure, and then trying again and falling short, often repeated ad nauseum. Sometimes, all that learning, impossible without the failure, leads you to see that aiming your ambition in a different direction would be better. Not because it's easier, not because you have given up, not because you are avoiding, but because you have learned through the vicissitudes of your experience that what you seek is not to be found where you were looking, or is simply not attainable in the manner by which you chose to pursue it. So, what might you do? What should you do as an alternative to hiding things in the fog? Admit to your feelings. This is a very tricky matter, and it does not simply mean give in to them. First, noting, much less communicating, feelings of petty anger or pain due to lonesomeness, or anxiety about something that might be trivial, or jealousy that is likely unwarranted, is embarrassing. The admission of such feelings is a revelation of ignorance, insufficiency, and vulnerability. Second, it is unsettling to allow for the possibility that your feelings, however overwhelming and convincing, might be misplaced and, in your ignorance, pointing you in the wrong direction. It is possible that you have misinterpreted the situation entirely for reasons of which you remain fundamentally unconscious. It is for such reasons that trust is vital, but trust of the mature and tragic sort. A naive person trusts because he or she believes that people are essentially or even universally trustworthy. But any person who has truly lived has been or has betrayed. Someone with experience knows that people are capable of deception and willing to deceive. That knowledge brings with it an arguably justified pessimism about human nature, personal and otherwise. But it also opens the door to another kind of faith in humanity, one based on courage rather than naivete. I will trust you. I will extend my hand to you, despite the risk of betrayal, because it is possible, through trust, to bring out the best in you, and perhaps in me. So, I will accept substantial risk to open the door to cooperation and negotiation. And even if you do betray me in a not too unforgivable manner, assuming a certain degree, shall we say, of genuine apology and contrition on your part, I will continue to extend my hand. And part of the way I will do that is by telling you what I am feeling. A certain necessary humility must accompany such raw revelations. I should not say, at least not ideally, "You have been ignoring me lately." I should say, instead, "I feel isolated and lonely and hurt, and cannot help but feel that you have not been as attentive to me over the last few months as I would have liked, or that might have been best for us as a couple. But I am unsure if I am just imagining all this because I am upset, or if I am genuinely seeing what is going on." The latter statement gets the point across, but avoids the accusatory stance that so often serves as the first defense against a serious get-to-the-bottom-of-things conversation. And it is very possible that you are wrong about just what is causing you to feel the way you do. If you are, you need to know it, because there is no point in propagating errors that are causing you and others pain and interfering with your future. Best to find out what is true. Best to disperse the fog, and to find out if the sharp objects you feared were lurking there are real or fantastical. And there is always the danger that some of them are real. But it is better to see them than to keep them occluded by the fog, because you can at least sometimes avoid the danger that you are willing to see. When I was reading through that passage, trying to find what I could isolate out from that book to describe the fog, I could have said willful blindness, but those two words taken in isolation are insufficient. They do not adequately capture the context of what Dr. Peterson is talking about in that section of the book. It is a certain type of willful blindness. It is a willful blindness that refuses, as he said in the text, to initiate. For the sake of completeness, it would probably be wise to render Dr. Peterson's passage into the form of a freestanding claim, but after having read that passage, I have faith in Dr. Peterson's ability to articulate himself that after having read that entire section of the book, the meaning of the fog should be sufficiently clear, although it is not portable at the moment. But alas, that's the tour of Dr. Peterson's term. This failure to initiate as we make our way up the inverted letter V is also exactly what arises from what Howard and I talk about as being the prisoner's dilemma. Just not going to initiate. In our own parlance, the term prisoner's dilemma and initiation are usually operating in tandem with each other. So it would perhaps be best, now that we have gone a sort of meandering tour of the fog, vis-a-vis Dr. Peterson's own words, we should probably start a meandering tour of the prisoner's dilemma. Now, for those of you at home who are unfamiliar with the precise mechanics of the prisoner's dilemma, we can go through what I call the classical version of the prisoner's dilemma, as it exists in academic philosophy. It's a term that also has become sort of a meme in general common parlance anyways. But for those of you who have not had the opportunity to actually dig into the meta, to dig into the original form in which the prisoner's dilemma arose, this is basically how it goes. You have two people who are arrested by the police, and they're put in different interrogation rooms in a manner where they are unable to communicate with each other. So you have person A and person B. So the way that the police interrogators are operating in this classical thought experiment is that they tell both person A and person B that if either one of them confesses to whatever crime it is that they may have committed, that the one who confesses will get a lighter sentence commuted. So let's say, for example, if the default punishment on the table is 10 years in jail, it doesn't really matter at this point. So they tell both person A and person B, if you just confess to the crime, you will only get 5 years in jail. What is unbeknownst to both A and B is that the interrogators are relying upon a confession in order to successfully levy a conviction. So what that creates is a situation where if both person A and person B keep their mouth shut, they can both walk, I believe is the original formulation of the classical case. If person A confesses and person B refuses, then person A gets 5 years, person B gets 10 years, same vice versa. And then if they both confess, then they will both get the 5 years. So then in the situation where person A and person B are unable to coordinate with each other, they have to make a wager. And the wager is that both person A and person B have to decide, do I confess or do I not? By way of providing the audience a sufficient tour is my rendering of the classical example, missing any details. Because the term prisoner's dilemma is something that already has emerged in the field of philosophy, we need to acknowledge going into this that the way that you specifically use the prisoner's dilemma is not 100% identical to the classical case. So, particularly with regards to its usage. And the meta behind that is something that we're going to have to unpack. But I feel it absolutely necessary to first acknowledge what the textbook classical case is before we move away from it. So that is to say, if nothing is jumping out at you as being dysfunctional about my description of the classical case, then we can move directly into your own rendering of how you present the prisoner's dilemma. Howard.
I wasn't quite following the way that you were assigning the arbitrary numbers, so I'm fairly certain that it was accurate enough. Just as a form of brief summary, both individuals have a binary decision to make, and both individuals have one of 4 possible situations that they could be in. So, depending on whether the individual in one room makes the same decision as the individual in another room, changes the outcome. So if they make the same decision, then there's one outcome. If they make opposite decisions, then there's another outcome. And basically, if the decisions are opposite, then one person gets punished severely and the other person does not. So there are also several variations on the classical model. So the exact case is not particularly important in terms of the first one that was ever presented. The variables do change, and people change the variables in order to get at different layers of meta, which is exactly what I do. So I don't feel bad about that.
So now that we have acknowledged the classical case, I want you to take us on a tour of how you adjust the variables to harvest the meta that is relevant to the way that we use it in our parlance. So now that we know what the variables are, I want you to start adjusting them and then start pointing out what emerges from those adjustments.
Before I start getting into that, this is a little bit of a strange situation that I find myself in, because typically I will be explaining this dilemma to another individual that doesn't understand it. And I've done that several times, but a tour is not typically the strategy that I would use to explain this to someone. There's always context that I can draw upon with the individual that I'm having a conversation with. So I would like to simplify the meta first. So I think the first step is to simplify some of the meta as much as I can in terms of the actual dilemma itself. And the best way to do that is to acknowledge a quadrant structure. So essentially, taking the punishments out of the equation for a moment, taking the scenario of being arrested for something that you didn't do out of the equation for a moment. The thumb up description of the dilemma itself is that there are 2 individuals, and you don't even need the limitation that they can't talk to each other, but I'll come back to that in a moment. You have 2 individuals, and both of these individuals need to make a binary decision. The variable that I would change is that essentially the binary decision is whether or not to initiate, which would require a kind of definition, of course. It's also worth noting, I'm fairly certain that this is clear at this point, that we're not talking about initiation as in a rite of passage, but initiation as in to initiate action or to choose to start to do something. But even before I talk about initiation itself, let's just say that there are two individuals and they both need to make a choice between option 1 or option 2, option X or option Y. Both individuals need to make the decision, and each can choose X or each can choose Y, for example. So the quadrant structure would be to acknowledge both people can choose X, one person can choose X, one person can choose Y, and then that can go the other way. One person can choose Y and one person can choose X, and then both individuals can choose Y. So there are 4 scenarios that happen depending on how these individuals make their choices. So the way that the dilemma is set up, typically I like to use diagrams for this, but alas, there's a situation basically where there could be XX, XY, YX, or YY. Is that fairly straightforward so far?
Continue.
So the way that I would explain this currently, my most recent iteration of this explanation, I would actually use a reference to Orwell and Newspeak.
1984. Newspeak in 1984.
Right, Newspeak, the language in 1984. Where you have a plus before something. Where you have something that's plus good, or double plus good, which is really good, or something that's plus bad, which is pretty bad, or double plus bad, which is really, really bad, terrible. So I can lay out the sequence verbally for person 1 and person 2 with option X and option Y. I'm just going to lay out the sequence and then see if I can describe it maybe in another way that's more concise. But I'm going to try it, see if it works. So, 4 scenarios. Scenario number 1, both individuals choose X. So, if both individuals choose X, then the outcome for both individuals, respectively, is plus good. So it's fine for both people. So, scenario 1. Person number 1 chooses X, person number 2 chooses X. The outcome for person number 1 is plus good. The outcome for person number 2 is plus good. Scenario number 2. Person number 1 chooses X, which is initiation, by the way. Person number 2 chooses Y. The outcome for person number 1 is double plus bad. Terrible. The outcome for person number 2 is double plus good. Great. Fantastic. That can be inverted. So person number 1 chooses option Y, and person number 2 chooses option X, in which case the outcome for person number 1 is double plus good. Fantastic. Great. And the outcome for person number 2 is double plus bad, which is terrible and horrible. Or both individuals can choose Y, so person number 1 chooses Y, person number 2 chooses Y. The outcome for person number 1 is plus bad, not good, but not terrible. And the outcome for person number 2 is plus bad, which is another way of saying not good, or not terrible, not good. It's not as bad as double plus bad.
I have a follow-up, but I want to let you finish first.
Well, when the question is posed, what's the best decision? If the choice is between X and Y, well, I, as an individual, can choose X, which means if I choose X, things are either going to be fine or they're going to be terrible. They're either going to be plus good or they're going to be double plus bad. If I choose Y, instead of just fine, things are great. And instead of really terrible, it's really only slightly terrible to choose Y. It would seem that every outcome at the individual level is better by choosing Y. Everything that X can do, Y can do more. It's an upgrade for all the possibilities. So why would I choose something that allows me to have worse options for myself when I need to make this decision? And the answer is when these decisions affect more than one person and the decisions become universal. And we start talking about coordination and cooperation, mutual benefits. The part of the chapter from Beyond Order where he was talking about, I will extend my hand to you in trust because we can actually both become better despite the fact that my reaching my hand out to trust you puts me at risk for double plus bad. It's the only way to have plus good for both people at the same time.
I already have 3 layers I want to try layering on top of this.
Well, there are several directions that I can also take it. So as a cornerstone, if that quadrant structure is sufficiently explained, then that's a really massive part of this that doesn't move.
So the quadrant structure itself is fine, but there is an auxiliary problem that we need to address. And that is the quadrant structure as you laid it out right now is way too thumb up. So what I'm going to do is I have a very thumb down example that I can offer. And I want you to tell me whether or not this thumb down example is a sufficiently accurate representation of the quadrant structure you just laid out. And the reason why I feel it is very necessary to bring this thumb down example forward is because we need to get into the double plus bad versus single plus bad.
Oh yeah, that's easy.
So here's the example that I have. So you tell me whether or not this thumb down example is a sufficient representation of the quadrant structure you just laid out. So many years ago, there was a game show on British television. The name of the game show was Golden Balls. The premise of the game show, like with most game shows, is that there's a jackpot cash prize at stake for winning the game, let's just say. Now, the game that this entire game show revolved around was a 2-player game. So you had player 1, you had player 2. And player 1 and player 2 would sit at this main table in the middle of this auditorium studio setting. And sitting in front of both player 1 and player 2 were 2 golden balls. So there was a total of 4 golden balls on the table. 2 available for player 1 and 2 available for player 2. Now, the cash prize was however many thousands of British pounds, whatever the large sum of money was. So for the sake of easy calculation, let's just say that it was £1 million. What the actual jackpot was doesn't matter. But what was most important about these golden balls that were on the table was that they opened up on a hinge. And that when you opened up these golden balls, on the inside of either one of these giant golden balls would be a word. And in one ball would be the word split. And the other ball would be the word steal. So the premise of the game was that both player 1 and player 2 had to make a choice as to which ball they were going to pick and hold and say, I'm going to play this one, I'm going to play this one. And the hype of the game show was such that the moderator of the game show would give player 1 and player 2 1 minute to talk and say, oh, we should do this or we should do that, or like, I'm totally going to pick the split one or whatever. Because the idea was that if both player 1 and player 2 picked the split ball, then whatever the cash prize was would then be split 50-50 down the middle, and 50% would go to player 1, 50% would go to player 2. If, however, one player chose steal and the other player chose split, then the person who chose the steal ball would get 100% of the cash prize, and the person who chose the split ball would get 0. However, if both player 1 and player 2 chose the steal ball, both player 1 and player 2 would get nothing. They'd get £0 and the cash prize would remain with the game show. So, my question to you is, true or false, this game show is an accurate representation of the quadrant structure you just laid out? Depending on what your answer is, I have a follow-up question.
I would say that that's a way to accurately describe a lot of the mechanics. So the variables I don't think are correct, but
Explain
the main
that.
mechanics of the structure are intact.
Explain why the variables are not correct.
Because plus bad and double plus bad are the same variable.
You actually hit right exactly on the follow-up question that I wanted to ask. So in the situation of this game show, from the perspective of the individual, the result of XY and YY are the same because you don't go below 0. So there are not 4 outcomes, there are only 3 outcomes in the context of the game show. from the perspective of the individual. You can either get 100% of the jackpot, you can get 50% of the jackpot, or you get 0 of the jackpot.
Correct.
So insofar as the quadrant structure that you laid out, there's a 4th option missing.
Yeah, there are a couple ways that you could account for that to adjust the variables of the game show if you want.
So, for example, if there was a 4th option where if both people chose steal, then there would be a charge. You would have to pay money.
No. If both people chose steal, it's 0. If one person chooses steal when the other person chooses split, the person who chose split also pays money to this person out of their own bank account.
I see. The charge
goes to the person who gets stolen from. They don't just take all the money, they also take more.
So
you lose money. If you want to put the punishment in there. Because otherwise, the way that you account for that is you just bring up the steal option from 0 to anything above 0. And then you make the punishment 0.
In the context of this quadrant structure, would both work?
Yeah. If both people chose steal, then you both get 10%, not 50. It just depends on how severe of a punishment you're trying to inflict.
Okay, so let's go with the lighter version. So then you're saying that for the game show to completely faithfully represent the quadrant structure, split would be 50% of the jackpot to player 1 and player 2. Steal would be,
let's say,
10%?
Really anything above 0.
Anything above 0.
5%, 10%.
So 5 or 10%, just some minuscule number of the jackpot, but they get something above 0.
You can make it 1% if you care, to cover your travel expenses.
And then split steal is the person who chose steal gets 100% of the jackpot. The person who chose split gets nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So that's a situation where, from the perspective of the individual player, you never want to choose split, because by choosing steal, you at least guarantee you are going to get a minimum of 5% of the jackpot, or whatever the minimum floor is.
Well, right. This drops into the structure in a pretty straightforward way. So, from the individual's perspective, if they choose steal, then the option is really good or something that's not 0. And if they choose split, then they're either going to get something that's somewhat good but not really good, by comparison at least, or 0. So both options are worse, therefore you always choose steal, unless you're trying to actually find the only option for mutual benefit. Because as soon as you universalize these decisions, then the only way to mutually benefit is to take the risk of being stolen from. Because if the other person also takes that risk, then you're actually both better off. If you universalize, for example, choosing steal, then everyone only gets 5% all the time. But if you universalize choosing split, then everyone gets 50% all the time, which is actually better. As soon as everyone makes these decisions, it has to be split. Because if everyone chooses steal, then there is no 100% option anymore. It eliminated itself. I also don't like this game show situation because the person that wins the jackpot is going to cause a celebration. And it's as if the person who is able to take advantage of the other person is the person that did things properly. But that's actually the complete opposite message of what the prisoner's dilemma is supposed to be trying to do and communicate. So that's another reason why I'm not terribly happy with the variables. But in terms of the mechanics, sure.
So basically, in a situation where you have 4 possible outcomes, what you're describing is a situation where the answer to the question of what should the individual pick flips and becomes diametrically opposite depending upon when you're just looking strictly at the individual versus when you are looking at what can be universalized, what can apply to everyone, and still maintain itself as a functional system.
Well, yes, or at least when the context broadens at all. And the thing about the game show, or the thing about this quadrant structure, or even the classical example of the prisoner's dilemma, it's never only one person who are in these examples. You have to have more than one person in order to actually make the case. It's more than one individual, and they are making decisions in such a way where they can actually mutually benefit. And that's one of the reasons why it surprised me that I haven't encountered more individuals that have taken the step of applying the prisoner's dilemma to the mechanics of a friendship, specifically. Whenever I talk about this, it's never in the context of people who are competing against each other. These aren't people that don't know each other. This is when I start changing the variables. because this is fundamental to friendship itself.
Or any healthy relationship, even as Beyond Order was talking about.
Yeah, or any healthy relationship. And there has to be a willingness for both individuals in a friendship, relationship of some kind, to initiate with the other person as opposed to wait for them.
There's a bit of a tightrope act that we need to be careful with here. Because on the one hand, in the past, when I've talked about initiation, a retort that people often levy at me is, initiate what? What does that mean? So, granted, that was during a time when I did not have Dr. Peterson's Beyond Order on hand. I think Dr. Peterson did a very good job in describing the necessity of taking the initiative to voice what you think on a particular issue, to not let the trivialities slide. But granted, that's not a freestanding claim. And on the other hand, what you are describing is a situation where the question of initiation, as it exists in a friendship, as it exists in a marital relationship, what have you, it fulfills this 4-quadrant structure.
Yeah.
As opposed to the 3 possible outcomes from the game show as it is originally laid out, in which Y, Y, and X, Y are collapsed into the same result. So there's a couple things we need to do. Number one is we need to come up with a freestanding claim that defines the term initiation, because I think that's what binds the prisoner's dilemma to the fog that Dr. Peterson describes. Because the failure to initiate results in the fog.
That's not exactly the way I would say it, but okay.
The next step out of that is we need to be able to demonstrate why the prisoner's dilemma, as it applies to initiation, is a possible outcome of 4 as opposed to a possible outcome of 3. So
Okay.
I think we should do it in that order. The freestanding definition of initiation would be...
Well, you were saying initiating what?
Right.
So I would say, in terms of some descriptions to apply to the term, it's an alternative to waiting for the other person to start something. You have to start something. You have to go out of your way to actively begin. And typically, you're not waiting to resolve a problem, but you are actively presenting that problem with the intention to resolve it.
How about this for a rough draft, a preliminary definition? Initiation is the practice of not waiting to resolve a point of contention.
I think that works fairly well for now. That's going to get cross-examined pretty severely in a moment, so we'll see if it sticks. The practice of not waiting to resolve a point of contention. Yeah, no matter the size. Okay. So then, the opposite of initiation would be the practice of waiting to resolve a point of contention.
I would say the practice of avoiding.
And that's going to be non-initiation?
That would be non-initiation. And the reason why I make that distinction is because you can conceivably have a situation where you have a calendar schedule. The time is coming where I need to have this talk with this person. I'm not prepared to have that talk yet, but I'm going to look at the calendar on such and such month of such and such day at such and such time. I know this person is going to be here, and I'm going to walk into the room and I'm going to say to this person, look, we need to sit down and have a talk. So that's technically quote unquote waiting, but I don't think that qualifies as non-initiation. That's just scheduling.
Sure. That's a form of waiting, but it's not the problematic form of waiting that I'm trying to get at.
Which is why when we talk about non-initiation, I would say that the proper verb to use there is avoiding.
Okay.
Which I also think is entirely consistent with the passage from Beyond Order that I just read.
There's something missing here. You have to recognize volition. I suppose that's part of the practice a little bit. It's a little bit implied rather than part of the definition.
The voluntary practice?
Yes. Maybe the voluntary practice. The fact that there's a choice being made is important because non-initiation is a decision. It might be a status quo decision. It could be the choice to do nothing, but the choice to do nothing is still a choice.
You mean non-initiation?
Correct.
Which is embedded in the verb avoidance. Because you don't need to say the voluntary avoidance.
I'd like to keep the voluntary practice of not waiting to resolve a point of contention versus the practice of avoiding to resolve a point of contention, and just keep it for now.
Yeah. So initiation is the voluntary practice of not waiting to resolve a point of contention.
Yeah. So now is where you replace the steal with non-initiation, the split with initiation, and you live together, your roommates. Just thinking about different ways to try and change the variables of your scenario here. But essentially, you start switching around whether or not friends or individuals at that point are choosing to initiate or otherwise practice non-initiation.
So the thing that I'm trying to map out is what is the game show equivalent of XY? What is the game show equivalent of stealing 100% of the jackpot in the situation where you have one person initiating and you have another person?
In this case,
doing
X would be
non-initiation.
initiation, Y would be non-initiation.
Mhm.
So you're talking about the consequences?
Right. How is it that X being initiation and Y being non-initiation results in a situation that is equivalent to one person getting 100% of the jackpot? What is that prize?
The benefit of someone else doing all the work for you?
Yeah, let's walk through like a very thumb down example of what that is. Because going from even beyond order, where Dr. Peterson was talking about his father-in-law about the plates, or his client who felt trapped in her own house because her husband just kept buying all this crap that she hated. But it wasn't worth the fight for her to say that she hated the 1960s and 70s wall art. She hated the furniture. Or even his hypothetical example of the person in a relationship who is feeling neglected, and then this person sees the spouse talking to the neighbor. In any of these instances, what does it look like for one person to be initiating the effort to try to resolve these grievances and the other person is choosing non-initiation?
So at this point, I find it imperative and essential to stress that a discussion of the prisoner's dilemma and a discussion of initiation is almost entirely, if not entirely, a preventative form of initiation itself. Once someone begins the practice of non-initiation in a relationship, that's the first step toward the destruction of that relationship. It's very difficult to turn it around from there. The only way that a friendship can stay healthy and sustainable is if, from the beginning, both parties are not waiting to resolve their points of contention. So you have 4 ways, but you can also reduce those 4 ways down to 3 ways. Not in the way that you were combining the consequences of something that was terrible with something that was mildly bad. But what you can do is you can acknowledge that the XY and YX can be combined in a way. Because both of those situations have one person in the double plus good and one person in the double plus bad. So in that way, you can combine the potential circumstances into plus good, double plus bad, double plus good, 2 of those, and then plus bad, which is more like factoring, kind of the way that I thought about it at the time, where you have a plus b times a plus b. So you get a squared plus 2ab plus b squared. So you can combine it that way if you wanted.
How does that square with what you just described as if you have anything other than XX? If you have anything other than both parties initiating, the result is that the relationship dies.
Yeah.
Which creates a situation where XY, YX, and YY, any permutation where non-initiation is present, the result is the relationship dies. Because XY, YX, and YY all have the same result. The only way for the relationship to continue is if both are initiated.
Over enough time, that's correct. Which means yes, this can be simplified down to 2 options.
Over a long enough time period.
Yeah.
Then we have to start having a conversation about time thresholds. Because on a distal time frame, these 4 possibilities collapse into 2. On a proximal time frame, within a short amount of time, how many possibilities are we dealing with? Because even Dr. Peterson, in the
4.
section of Beyond Order I was just reading, acknowledges that there is short-term gains to be had for non-initiation.
At the individual level, there are 4 scenarios.
He talks about basically the fake piece. Basically, it's the part where he describes a situation where in the short term, the reward for non-initiation is quote-unquote peace, but it's a peace that you don't want to have because it turns into something horrifying. So, you just said that in the short term, you still have the 4 options. So how does that play out? What I'm not seeing at the moment is what is the equivalent of getting 100% of the jackpot in a situation where person A chooses non-initiation and the other person chooses initiation?
Sure, no problem. So the way that I typically start to bring the thumb down on the quadrant structure is to describe somewhat of an allegory. And this was something that even contributed significantly to the genesis of what led me to what I see to be a solution to this problem, which is a very serious problem, and one that I seek to prevent in all of my friendships. It is what I might refer to as the allegory of the dishes. So, essentially, I was living in an apartment with roommates during my time at university, and it wasn't just with our household. This seemed to be a very common problem. Whenever I talk to someone else about this, there's always something that they've seen because it's such an easy example of exactly the kind of spiraling horror that something very simple can become if initiation is not dealt with properly. The problem is simply some people, when you're living with them, don't do their own dishes. And when someone doesn't do their dishes, you have to figure out what to do about that. Someone doesn't do their own dishes, they have dirty dishes in the sink, and that is creating what we might call a point of contention. What typically happens is that the dishes will stay in the sink for maybe a day. And then maybe one of the roommates will say, all right, well, I want to clean sinks, so I'm going to lead by example, and I'm just going to do all the dishes. And I'm going to go out of my way to do my roommate's dishes because I am such a great person. And then you do your roommate's dishes. And it's annoying because it's more work than you signed up for. And they didn't have to do anything. And the sink is clean for a few hours. And then there are more dishes. Again, the question comes, what do you do when there are more dishes? And perhaps you will choose to do your roommate's dishes again. And this process might repeat until you're tired of doing your roommate's dishes. Because the thing is, it's a lot of extra work for you. It's not your responsibility to do your roommate's dishes. They're his dishes. He should be able to wash the dishes. And why would you waste your time doing your roommate's dishes when it's their responsibility to do their own dishes? That's when the resentment builds. The point of contention is not resolved directly. In the allegory, the person who does the dishes for their roommate starts to develop a sense of debt.
Of debt owed to him.
Correct.
Or her.
They're doing the dishes, and they're doing more work than is owed to them, which means that they're going to be rewarded for it somehow in the future. There's a trade. There's some kind of balance. Justice will be had somehow.
Reciprocity will come somewhere.
Exactly. I'm not going to just do all of this work because I'm a fool. This will somehow work out to benefit me with reciprocity in some way. Typically, the next stage of what would happen is that basically you, the person that just did all of the dishes, come home from a long day of work or class or both to see a full sink of dishes plus the dirty pans, and this is just too much. But it's not enough to resolve the point of contention. It's enough to not do the dishes for them anymore. No, this time the strategy has changed. I'm not going to do the dishes for them. I'm going to wait until they do their own dishes. And maybe 3 days goes by, and they still didn't do their own dishes. But the fact of the matter is, there are no more plates to eat off of. And now, the roommate must do some dishes of some kind in order to be able to use the pan in order to cook something or eat off of something, or there are no clean dishes left to dirty, so you must clean them yourself.
Oh wait, he's eating off a paper towel now.
That could happen. If we were going to joke about it, then he's eating off of a paper towel and he's scooped up all of the dishes and put them all into the trash can.
And all of this could have been resolved just by installing a dishwasher.
Well, the people in this allegory are on a budget. They cannot afford a dishwasher, so they're going to have to do their own dishes. And even still, loading the dishwasher is not something that's done instantaneously. You still have to put effort into actually putting things into the dishwasher, even though there's less of an excuse for it. But I digress. Perhaps only the dishes that they need are the dishes that get washed. And maybe that's enough. It's like, all right, you wash something. Maybe I will even do some dishes, or maybe I'll help you to dry the dishes, or maybe I will show some kind of support. Yes, that's the right thing that you should be doing. You should be doing the dishes. Maybe they even do all the dishes all by themselves and you watch them. It's feasible, actually. You don't help them. Say, all right, finally, someone else pulling their weight. It's good to see that finally happening. And they do the dishes once, and lo and behold, the problem is not solved. Because the next day, there are yet more dishes.
So in this allegory, the example of somebody getting 100% of the jackpot versus 50% of the jackpot is that by not initiating, they get to have somebody else do their dishes for them.
Correct. They don't have to do anything. All the dishes are just always clean all the time for them. And the other person has to do double the work. So there even becomes a situation where maybe there aren't dishes in the sink again the next day. Maybe 3 days go by and they've done their own dishes every day. Well, you know what? I did a lot of dishes. So I'm going to leave some dishes in the sink now, and then he's going to do them for me. There's the reciprocity, the way that the debt can be repaid. And maybe he does do some of them. But the numbers for when that debt is repaid are never going to match. The person who is just learning now that he should be doing the dishes isn't going to do enough dishes to be able to trade. Especially if the person who started doing the dishes first is looking at them saying, all right, well, I did way more, so you, the roommate, can do my dishes enough that it's even past zero and above that, and then I'll bring it back down, and then that's how we actually have reciprocity. And you would have reciprocity for that, but that's not what's going to happen. What's going to happen is that at some point along the way, the roommate is going to say, all right, my debt is paid, and this is done, this is enough. But those dishes stay in the sink. They don't get done by anyone. Typically at this point, the roommate would regress into just adding more dishes onto the sink. And now is when things devolve to the point where no one does any dishes ever. It's very easy to get to the point, sequentially, where no one ever does any dishes ever. And once someone stops and starts waiting for the other person to do the dishes for them, that's the beginning of the end. Because that's the path that leads to no one ever being able to be repaid and everyone always waiting for the other person. And that's how it is with friendships. When it comes to the dishes, there are these two scenarios. If I were to say that non-initiation of doing the dishes leads to no one doing the dishes. That's not mutually optimal for anyone. But what is mutually optimal for everyone is for both people to not only do their own dishes, but to have the expectation to do all of their own dishes plus a little bit more. That accounts for the problem of someone thinking that they did all of their own dishes. Maybe they missed something. Sometimes you forget that that was your bowl. Sometimes someone else forgets that that was their bowl. But that little bowl, if it's not accounted for, snowballs into the same problem. Which is why I say, everyone, do all of your own dishes, plus be okay with doing not everyone else's dishes all the time. But if you have some plates and bowls to wash, and there's another 2 plates and a bowl that you know is not yours, no problem. And that's what universally will actually keep the house running at all. That's the only chance that everyone has at having a clean sink, which is actually better than having a sink that is rotting. So everything you're responsible for plus a little bit more in terms of trying to get to the point where everyone accepts that from the very beginning. It's very simple to establish from the beginning before any of these problems corrupt the ability to continue. That's also why I stress that it's preventative. It makes sense if you already know from the beginning this is how it works. But otherwise, you're going to be caught in the grip of this festering corruption that leads to both parties waiting for the other person to start.
Do these procedures only work as preventative measures? The reason why I ask that question is because I'm trying to transfer the allegory of the dishes into other thumb down examples that Dr. Peterson describes in Beyond Order. Just going off of the definition of initiation. Initiation is the voluntary practice of not waiting to resolve a point of contention. Okay. Hey, person. Hey, friend. Hey, spouse. I'm feeling neglected. I'm feeling whatever. The entire part where he describes, I feel isolated and lonely and hurt and cannot help but feel that you have not been as attentive to me over the last few months as I would have liked, or that might have been best for us as a couple. This is a form of initiation. I am dissatisfied with this behavior. Now, it is very important to acknowledge that on the previous page, he couches that in, you may have completely misinterpreted the situation. Your observation might be completely off, but that will become hashed out in the dialogue. So I look at an example like this, and I can't help but wonder at a couple of points. Point number one is that I don't think Dr. Peterson is describing this mechanism of initiation as only being functional as a preventative mechanism. It can work to fix situations, to make things better, to make unoptimal situations far better than they were. What I'm trying to wrap my head around is how it is that in such situations, somebody is rewarded for non-initiation. Because one of the things that Dr. Peterson seems to be describing, particularly when he talks about the problem of keeping things in the fog, the problem of letting the quote-unquote trivial things go, you're actually getting punished for that. That's actually going to make your life worse.
Well, I'm hoping this is not dodging the question when I say that even in that circumstance, that initiation is looking to prevent problems within the future. So it is still, in a way, preventative. And it has to be because in order for that example for initiation to be considered proper, you have to be considering alternatives. You have to be considering the alternatives to the situations that happened, so as to create better situations going into the future. If you're not creating those alternatives, then there's no dialogue to be had. It's not a form of initiation anymore, it's just a string of intangible statements. And they are getting punished. Because if you're not in the voluntary practice of actively working basically to resolve points of contention, then there is punishment for that in the form of brooding or in other forms of misery that are described in this chapter of the book.
What seems to be interesting in terms of unifying the prisoner's dilemma as you presented it and the fog, as Dr. Peterson describes in this book, when he talks about the third rule, don't hide things in the fog, is regardless of if it's a 4-quadrant structure, or we haven't really parsed out examples of 3-result structures, but on a long enough timeline, all the possible outcomes just collapse into 2. It's either going to collapse into the relationship dissolves, implodes, or the relationship maintains its self-correction mechanism of resolving contentions and is able to proceed and grow.
This is an answer to a reason for why relationships get destroyed, for what seems like no reason. There is a reason. If you stop initiating, it will destroy the relationship. That's actually quite useful if you know that you don't want to be a part of that relationship. But don't practice the process of destroying relationships for the relationships that you actually want to keep. Essentially, friendship is a situation that can only exist, again, in any kind of sustainable way so long as both parties are mutually initiating all the time to try and not wait to resolve points of contention.
It's not just friendship, it's any relationship. And that's perhaps starting to emerge out of this, is that the injection of non-initiation over a long enough period of time destroys any human-to-human interaction, whether it's friend to friend, whether it's husband to wife, whether it's parent to child.
Okay. So before I look at some of those thumb-down examples more specifically, I just wanted to also clarify that the alternative to initiating in terms of a relationship manifests in the form of waiting. So avoiding also being a subcategory of waiting, because you can have waiting that's not avoiding. You can have waiting that's scheduling.
Mm-hmm.
So avoiding is a subcategory of waiting. Into the grid it goes.
Useful, that is.
As soon as someone starts waiting for the other person to initiate in a relationship, that's the beginning of the end. Because all roads, once someone starts waiting, if not addressed and turned around, and you can turn them around, but you have to know what you're doing, and maybe a discussion like this, or maybe a passage like the one that you opened with from Beyond Order, maybe that will change the direction to create a situation where both parties can mutually benefit. Again, because otherwise you're stuck in the individual perception mode rather than the universally applied principles mode. And when you're looking at something as an individual, you're basically going to be incentivized toward the direction that will destroy the relationship. What that looks like in practice is one person starts waiting for the other person, just like they're waiting for the other person to do the dishes. Could be dishes, could be something else, because this is about more than the dishes. Even in the case of the people who are having a point of contention over the dishes, that point of contention extends past their interactions with the dishes and into their relationship as roommates. As soon as someone starts waiting for the other person to initiate, that's what creates the problem where, well, maybe the other person will keep initiating for a time, thinking that they're going to be able to get that debt repaid to them. Maybe they'll stop initiating and then things get worse for a time and then you start initiating again, but that debt can never actually be repaid. And what happens is one person starts waiting for the other person to initiate, and then both people wait for the other party to begin. And then nobody says anything to each other. And that's how the relationship gets destroyed.
That leads to the situations of Dr. Peterson's female client as he was describing.
For example. Or that even leads to a situation where if there's someone that's initiating, at the point where anyone stops and waits for that initiation to show up again, they're only going to initiate for a time before they themselves stop, because the only way for sustainability to occur is if that initiation is happening mutually. Responding with non-initiation in the face of initiation is going to lead to that initiation changing to non-initiation. Is that what you want? Sometimes it is. If you want someone to go away, it actually works pretty well. So basically, both people waiting for each other, that's just a description of ostracism. But one person initiating and one person doing double work while the other person does nothing, it's slightly hyperbole, but it's in the direction of treachery.
It's a surefire path to relational disaster.
Well, right, because how do you recover from that unless both people have a start from the beginning, which is the trust, going back to the passage, the trust that the other person isn't going to expect them to do all the work for them.
Exploit your vulnerability.
It takes work to initiate. That's not an easy thing to do. And if only one person is initiating and the other person is just sitting back and benefiting from all that work, but not putting in any of the work themselves, it's going to lead to a situation where nobody has anything to say to each other anymore. Or you both have a lot to talk about all the time, which is better, considering it's friendship that you're after.
Or any relationship.
We can go into a couple more of those relationships other than friendships. I'm just using friendships because that's my historical example of how I apply this.
Well, it also can readily explain how relationships between parents and their children can turn pathological. What happens when you have parents who stop initiating? What happens when you have parents, you have mothers, you have fathers, who look at their child and say, all right, it is your job, the child, to initiate, because I, as the elder, as the adult, am absolved from having to initiate. So I get to recline in non-initiation.
Because I initiated changing your diapers? Is that where you're going?
Yeah. I need to pull out that part where he talks about the tests of the spikes.
Keep fumbling around in the fog and stumble into the spikes of my ambitions.
So what non-initiation looks like as the avoidance of resolving a point of contention, I think is perfectly described here in Dr. Peterson's book, where he says, you must nonetheless still live among other people and they with you, and you have desires, wants, and needs, however unstated and unclear. And you are still motivated to pursue them, not least because it is impossible to live without desire, want, and need. Your strategy under such conditions should Show your disappointment whenever someone close to you makes you unhappy. Allow yourself the luxury and pleasure of resentment when something does not go your way. Ensure that the person who has transgressed against you is frozen out by your disapproval. Force them to discover, with as much difficulty as possible, exactly what they have done to disappoint you. And finally, let them grope around blindly in the fog that you have generated around yourself until they stumble into and injure themselves on the sharp hidden edges of your unrevealed preferences and dreams. And maybe these responses are tests too, tests deeply associated with the lack of courage to trust. Lack of courage to trust, I add emphasis. Quote, if you really loved me, you would brave the terrible landscape that I have arrayed around myself to discover the real me, end quote. This passage right here is exactly the image of what it looks like when a parent injects non-initiation into a relationship with their child. This is not just between friends. This is not just between husband and wife. Parents, vis-a-vis non-initiation, can also completely destroy their own relationships with their children. I want a good relationship with my children, and they must do all the work. They must understand my unrevealed preferences and dreams. You should just know.
In that example, I would agree. That would be a thumb down example of pathology in terms of a parent and a child. And what I would layer onto this as well is that when non-initiation destroys a relationship, once you know the mechanics are quite simple and sequential once you actually lay out the quadrant and internalize it. And once you understand that this is about decisions that are made with universal principles and not based on what would otherwise be hypocritical principles, the decision for mutual benefit or the decision to destroy a relationship becomes something that that individual is responsible for. That's another reason why I stress the power of this being preventative. Because once this information is in articulated knowledge and acknowledged between two parties, at the point where initiation is not seen or otherwise someone is practicing non-initiation, that's a sign of their decision to end the relationship. You're doing this on purpose. Everybody agrees to the rules so long as they aren't corrupted already. It's easier for everyone to agree if it's used preventatively.
You're not already bound inside of a relationship.
Yeah, and you're not already trying to defend your previous history.
This is also what makes the relationship between parent and child so toxic, is because you don't get to choose whether or not you enter into a relationship with your parents. It's different with finding a significant other, finding a boyfriend, finding a girlfriend, finding a husband, finding a wife, because you can choose to walk into that. You can choose to stay away.
And there's a way to choose, and there's a way to stay away. I agree.
So I have a couple of definitions that I can submit for cross-examination, see if they stick. But it looks to be that the definition for initiation and non-initiation is sticking. So just by way of thoroughness, initiation is the voluntary practice of not waiting to resolve a point of contention. I have a corollary to that. So corollary states, contention resolution requires the acceptance that one's observations might be inaccurate, which is just a distillation of Dr. Peterson's paragraph about being able to approach the process of contention resolutions with a very necessary element of humility. It's so important, I'll even just quote the line again. It is possible that you have misinterpreted the situation entirely, for reasons of which you remain fundamentally unconscious. It is for such reasons that trust is vital, but trust of the mature and tragic sort. And the part where he says, a certain necessary humility must accompany such raw revelations. I should not say, at least not ideally, you have been ignoring me lately. I should say instead, I feel isolated, lonely, and hurt. The latter statement gets the point across, but avoids the accusatory stance that so often serves as the first defense against a serious get to the bottom of things conversation. So that corollary is just a distillation of that point.
I agree that humility is important, but it's also as you're talking about pathology, vital to recognize that there was a corollary in the quote that you just gave, which was that there's trust required, but basically that there is trust that is appropriate and inappropriate. There's a distinction there. There's a division of the knife between the appropriate versus the inappropriate trust. The inappropriate trust being the naive trust. The appropriate trust being the mature and tragic kind. And that's because trust doesn't mean everyone is trustworthy. Trust means I'm going to take the risk that you're not going to choose the path to ostracism. Because at least there's a chance of having a mutually productive relationship. Otherwise, we definitely don't have a mutually productive relationship. We only have ostracism. So if you choose that path, then I pay a heavy price for not just skipping to ostracism right away, because we'll eventually get there. But if my decision for mutual benefits is universalized, then everyone's better off. So contention resolution requires the acceptance that one's observations might be inaccurate. Sure. And this is also within the context of someone that's not so pathological that they're going to take advantage of that vulnerability. So long as that doubt in one's observations is not subject to being weaponized and turned into a form of manipulation, then yes, I agree. You don't want to enter the situation saying that I know with epistemic certainty that I'm correct. You have to allow for the chance of being wrong, but you also have to be able to evaluate what's in front of you on first principles. That shouldn't be a contradiction. So part of the first principles allow for your own inadequacies or your own formulations to be replaced with improved alternatives. I think that's what your corollary is trying to get at. So there has to be a way for your initial formulation to also be replaced by a better alternative.
Right.
And if you don't allow for that better alternative, then you're losing access to the logos by just overcommitting to the wrong formulation, rather than otherwise, again, allowing it to be appropriately replaced.
Shall I carry on down the list?
If you're satisfied with that, then yeah, keep going.
So non-initiation then would be the active avoidance of resolving a point of contention.
You could be choosing to avoid something.
Mm-hmm.
That's perfectly possible. But avoiding to resolve a point of contention can also take the form of inaction, so long as both of those are accounted for.
So here's my proposal for prisoner's dilemma. The prisoner's dilemma is a quadrant structure of permutations in which large unilateral benefit might be gained in the short term, but will result in certain relational devastation in the long term if the individual opts for said unilateral gain.
If the individual opts for said unilateral gain rather than what? Rather than mutual initiation? The solution needs to be part of the definition.
At the expense of
Smaller but universal gain?
At the expense of relational prosperity.
But isn't that built into relational devastation?
Let me try this. At the expense of relational prosperity arising from mutual initiation. It's a mouthful, but at least it's one sentence. The prisoner's dilemma is a quadrant structure of permutations in which large unilateral benefit might be gained in the short term, but will result in certain relational devastation in the long term if the individual opts for said unilateral benefit at the expense of relational prosperity that can arise from mutual initiation.
The only thing that I would add in there is the timeline for relational prosperity. So sustained relational prosperity or long-term relational prosperity.
Let's use sustained because we already used long-term. The prisoner's dilemma is a quadrant structure of permutations in which large unilateral benefit might be gained in the short term, but will result in certain relational devastation in the long term if the individual opts for said unilateral benefit at the expense of sustainable relational prosperity that can arise from mutual initiation.
It's not bad.
It's a lot, but it's a sentence.
Keep it for now.
So the last one that I have is the fog. The fog is a metaphor for willful blindness pertaining to that which will keep a relationship sustainable and prosperous.
that reads like willful blindness keeps relationships sustainable and prosperous.
How is that possible? Because willful blindness is immediately preceded by pertaining to. The full stop is the fog is a metaphor for willful blindness, period. Well, what about this willful blindness? The willful blindness pertains to that which will keep a relationship sustainable and prosperous.
You're trying to derive a portable definition of the fog. Willful blindness, as it was described, is a situation where you could come to know something, but you stop in order to stay comfortable. The act of hiding something is somewhat contained within willful blindness, but when something is in the fog, you're hiding it in the fog. Also, it's in a place. The fog is in a location, around something. There's a thing that exists, and the fog is around it. And it exists because you can specify what it is. I want to try something.
All right.
So there are some things in the definition of the fog that I'm trying to account for. So the fog is a metaphor for the chosen location to hide material rather than to fully specify and examine that material. Despite this specification and examination being better in the long term, particularly pertaining to that which will keep a relationship sustainable and prosperous.
My alternative would be the fog is a metaphor for the process of hiding material, whether purposeful or inadvertent, rather than fully specifying or examining that material. The rest is fine. My change is the chosen location.
I was just looking at chosen because it's more than just, here's the place where I hide things. It's like, I know where this place is if I ask myself the location of where the things are. It's not an unknown location. It's a known location. I think that's accounted for in this adjustment.
So could you read off the newest version one more time? I have the fog is a metaphor for the process of hiding material, whether purposefully or inadvertently, rather than fully specifying and examining that material.
Despite this specification and examination being better in the long term, particularly pertaining to that which will or will not keep a relationship sustainable and prosperous. I slid an or will not in there.
So from top to the bottom is the fog is a metaphor for the process of hiding material, whether purposefully or inadvertently, rather than fully specifying and examining that material. Despite this specification and examination being better in the long term, particularly pertaining to that which will or will not keep a relationship sustainable and prosperous.
That's the best we have so far.
Another mouthful.
But I think it works at least good enough.
It's good enough.
It's functional.
It's functional.
It can be improved.
It's a sufficient distillation of work that Dr. Peterson already specifies, spends an entire chapter talking about.
Yeah.
So that accounts for all the terms.
We're just going to call that portable.
It is a sentence.
Well, it's not a chapter.
It is a sentence. It is a freestanding claim.
Despite the fact that it's better in the long term, actually specify this material and therefore pull it out of the fog. So that's what parallels into what keeps relationships or doesn't keep relationships sustainable and prosperous. Whether or not you pull the thing out of the fog and actually specify what it is, or you continue to engage in the process of hiding that material. And then the further description is something that we've already read.
Anything you'd like to say?
Understanding the mechanics of the prisoner's dilemma and how it relates to initiation, the use of initiation, the decision to initiate is absolutely vital to maintaining and growing friendships and community. The mechanic is not overly complex, but it does take some effort to internalize, cross-examine. When used properly, it's a mechanism which enables healthy relationships, because it's the only option that allows for the possibility of a healthy relationship. It's what leads to the trust of the mature and tragic kind. The decision to initiate will almost certainly at some point lead to someone who initiates getting taken advantage of. That seems fairly simple in its inevitability. But despite this person getting taken advantage of, there's still a way to recognize the mechanics of what's happening and still choose the option which extends that hand of trust so long as there's reason to do so. This is largely a preventative measure because if the treachery has already occurred and someone has already demonstrated that they're not trustworthy, rebuilding the bridge of trustworthiness is not impossible, but also not ideal. Ideally, everyone in the household understands from the beginning that they need to do not only their own dishes, but a little bit of everyone else's in order for the house to run, in order to stop these problems from even occurring in the first place. And a misstep has very serious consequences that you need to know about. Missteps destroy relationships. And if you know exactly what causes the sustainability of a relationship or the destruction of a relationship, you can take responsibility for whether that relationship is sustained or destroyed. For someone who's interested in the question of what's better, access to generating the answer to the question of what's better in the use of the logos, mutual sustainability is a universal principle. Which is better? Prevent these problems. You can go so far as to say they ought not exist.
Ladies and gentlemen, this has been the Garage. Until next time, Vidariu Esperante. Keep breathing, everyone.